Welcome back, everybody. Long time no see. Well, I don't see much of you, but you see a lot of me. Didn't mean to make that rhyme. Anyway, this is Adam Welch, Photographist, back with you for another episode of Straight Talk on Photography. And today we're going to be covering something that is just damnably mind-blowing to a lot of people. You know, it's hard for me too. Sometimes it's still confusing for me. And that is aperture. Going to be talking about the hole today. Now let's boil it down to what exactly is aperture. The meaning of the word literally means just a hole or an opening as it pertains to us, unless you're some kind of, we won't go into that. As it pertains to us as photographers and photo makers, camera jockeys, that kind of thing, we're talking about aperture, and that's going to be the opening in our camera lens. That's what lets the light pass through the lens into the camera and make our image. Pretty simple. Well, you know, it actually is, but then again, it's not. The big sticking point a lot of people have about aperture, one is the dreaded f-stop, the F number. Two, how it controls depth of field. And really three, how it controls the overall amount of light that goes into your camera, thusly your ability to shoot in low light. You hear a lot of people talking about fast lenses, that kind of thing. When they talk about fast lenses, they are referring to their maximum aperture. Now, what is maximum aperture and minimum aperture for that matter? So let's start with, that's going to have to do with those F numbers. And this shit is confusing, but I've got an idea to show you how easy it really can be. When we're talking about F numbers, an F number or an f-stop, we're talking about the size of the aperture, the size of the opening in relation to the focal length of the lens. So that is a ratio. And I hate math, and I hope you do too. But the actual necessity that you need to know about aperture and F numbers is that it is an inverse proportion. The F number, as it gets bigger, like let's say F8, as that number gets bigger, let's say going to F11, the size of your aperture is going to get smaller. And that's the big problem people have with aperture, is that it's so confusing because it's not logical, really, the way we think. We think, a bigger aperture, a larger opening, you would think a bigger F number, but that's not the case. I have a nifty little way to show you this, and honestly, it's best done on one of these old, silky smooth manual lenses. This is a Nikkor 85mm f1.4. Just a sexy little beast of a lens. And the great thing about it with these old lenses, aside from them being built like a tank, is they have manual aperture rings. So you actually control the size of the aperture independently of your camera with this little aperture ring here, and it's a great way to demonstrate exactly how aperture works and why the f-stop makes sense, mostly makes sense. So what I'm gonna do now, the minimum aperture, that is the largest F number, the smallest hole for this lens is f16. The maximum aperture, the largest or widest aperture, the largest hole is f1.4. So we're going to start there. And if you can see, hopefully you can see how big that opening is. That's f1.4. As we move to f2, f2.8, jumping all the way to f5.6, the number's getting bigger, but you can see the hole itself is getting smaller. And we're going to go all the way over to f16. Now, the larger the aperture, the more light comes in because it's a larger hole. And you can see here, the smaller the aperture, the larger F number, the less light is coming in. And from an optical point of view, the larger the aperture, the wider the hole, there's a divergence of the light that comes in, and that actually plays a part in the depth of field. That's why at f1.4, this wide open aperture, you're going to have a very shallow depth of field, and a lot of that is controlled by the actual focal length of the lens and how far your subject is away from the background, that background blur, that bokeh. But a big part of that is also controlled by the aperture. So a wider aperture, more blur in the background, that kind of thing, a more shallow depth of field, the less is going to be in focus. But as we move to a smaller aperture, a larger F number, less light comes in, the actual image diverges more, and that's going to bring about a more I guess, deep depth of field, a larger depth of field, but it lets in less light, so you can't shoot in such low light as you would be with a larger aperture or a smaller f number. Kind of makes sense? Clear as mud? Okay. Be sure to put the questions down the bottom. Please, I'll be happy to answer them, or the best that I can. So hopefully that is a graphic representation of aperture and the f number. So always remember that the larger the f number, we saw f16, the hole was actually smaller, a lot smaller than it was at f14. Now f14, larger opening, works better in low light, a lot more shallow depth of field, you know, and then you move to those larger f numbers, smaller hole. So the f number, still kind of confusing, doesn't have to be, but that is the information that you will need, and that will go a long way with you. So guys, that's really it on that big scary thing called aperture. The f-stops, f numbers, that kind of thing. I wish there were f words, but you know, fuck it. Anyway, aperture doesn't have to be scary, but it is something that you need to know and have a good grasp of if you're going to actually improve your photography and be able to control the images that you make. It's something that, I'm sorry, you can't skimp on. But take it from me, it is what you need to know, and that's what I practice virtually every day when I'm shooting as a, quote, professional working photographer. Anyway, as I said, you know, aperture, f number, as the f number gets bigger, hole gets smaller, less light, more depth of field. As that f number gets smaller, that hole is going to open up. It's going to let in more light. That means a more, I guess, low light sensitive type of shooting. You can shoot in lower light situations, but the depth of field is going to shrink, and it's going to make a lot less of the image in focus. And that's really all. Like I said, check it out on, I've wrote 2 or 3 articles on Aperture on Digital Photography School. I think even on like Live Pixel, maybe a couple others. I post a link in the description below. And seriously, folks, ask me questions. I'll be open and honest with you, and I'll help you any way that I can. This has been a great, long-awaited next episode of Straight Talk on Photography. I'm Adam Welch, and as always, I will see you next time.